Picture this, a war so massive it stretched from the frozen tundra of Alaska to the steaming jungles of the Pacific. Millions of American soldiers shipped off to places they couldn't even point to on a map before the war. Now here's the real kicker. When they got there weren't any barracks, no houses, not even a roof over their heads, just mud, rain, and the elements beating down. So how did the U.S. military solve this? They didn't ship lumber halfway across the world. They didn't waste time building fancy bases. They invented one of the strangest, yet most effective solutions you've probably never thought about: the Quonset hut. A curved, corrugated steel half-cylinder that could pop up anywhere, anytime, and keep soldiers alive. And let me hit you with a number that's going to stick in your brain. More than 100,000 of these huts were built during World War II. That's not a typo. That's an industrial flood of steel and sweat, turned into homes, hospitals, command centers, and even chapels. Imagine landing on a remote island in the Pacific in 1943 and watching one of these structures rise out of the dirt in a single day, ready to house dozens of men. It almost sounds like science fiction, but it was real. Here's the shocker. These huts weren't just military quick fixes. They were a quiet revolution in logistics and housing. Think about it. World War II wasn't just fought with bullets and tanks. It was fought with supply lines, infrastructure, and the ability to keep men fed, sheltered, and ready. The Germans had their fortresses. The Japanese had their caves. But the Americans? They had a portable, packable, indestructible hut that could be shipped flat, assembled with a handful of guys, and survive a typhoon. That's the kind of edge that doesn't make it into Hollywood war movies, but it made a difference. Turned into a permanent stamp on history. It's a story about steel, sweat, and sheer American ingenuity. And trust me, you'll never look at a half-cylinder the same way again. By late 1941, America was staring down a logistical nightmare. The attack on Pearl Harbor forced the U.S. into a global war that would demand troops in every corner of the planet. Millions of men were about to ship out, and every single one of them needed food, water, and a roof over their heads. But the problem was clear. How do you house an army that's constantly on the move? Traditional wooden barracks took too long to build, and shipping heavy construction materials halfway across the world was out of the question. The military needed something new, something fast, cheap, portable, and tough enough to handle everything from blizzards to monsoons. This urgency wasn't just about soldiers fighting North Africa, where the Navy stepped in. In early 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy realized it would need portable housing for its expanding bases. They didn't want bulky tents that ripped in the wind. They didn't want wooden shacks that rotted in the jungle. They wanted a building you could box up, ship anywhere, and bolt together with minimal tools. The kind of structure sailors and soldiers could erect in hours, not weeks. At the time, the U.S. military had experimented with something called the Quonset hut, a British design from World War I. Invented in 1916 by Major Peter Neeson, it was also a curved steel structure. The British had used them in France, but the American planners decided it wasn't quite right. They wanted something simple, So by the time American soldiers started shipping out in early 1942, the groundwork for their future homes had already been laid. What looked like a simple curved shell was actually the answer to one of the biggest logistical headaches of World War II. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't flashy, but without it, thousands of men would have been left exposed in the field, vulnerable not just to enemy fire, but to the relentless punishment of weather and terrain. This wasn't just about architecture, it was about survival. And America was about to prove that solving problems like these, fast and at scale, was one of its greatest strengths in the war. When the Navy sent out the call in 1941 for a new type of building, the job landed on the laps of architects and engineers like George A. Ford. Looking at the naval construction accounting center, the task was straightforward on paper, but monumental in practice. Create a structure that was cheap, flat-packable, and easy enough for untrained men to assemble with only the most basic tools. It had to be rugged enough to withstand heat, dark, cold, and everything in between. The design that came up with was brilliantly simple. Picture a half-cylinder made of corrugated steel sheets, arched into a 16 by 36-foot structure. The semicircular shape wasn't just for looks, it gave the hut incredible strength, allowing wind, rain, and snow to slide right off. At each end, plywood panels could be fitted with doors, windows, or vents, depending on the climate and purpose. Inside, the huts could be lined with insulation or left bare. The entire thing was mounted on a simple wooden or concrete foundation, depending on the site. The first prototypes were built at Quonset Point in mid-1941, which is where the huts got their name. They weren't flashy, they weren't luxurious, but they were exactly what the Navy needed. They could be packed into crates small enough to fit on ships and planes, shipped thousands of miles, and then bolted together on the spot. Crew of 6 to 8 men could throw one up in a single day. Compare that to weeks of hammering towards electrification barracks, and you see why the Quonset hut was an instant hit. The initial design wasn't perfect. The first huts had a 16-foot length of wood that was variants quickly popped up for everything from barracks to mess halls, offices, hospitals, and even chapels. The modular design meant you could link huts together, extend them, or modify them on the fly. That flexibility was priceless in war zones where needs changed overnight. By late 1941, the Navy had already placed massive orders. The design was locked in, and factories began stamping out corrugated steel panels by the ton. The Quonset hut was officially rolling off production lines, even as America was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. By the time U.S. troops were landing on WWII in August 1942, the huts were already there, waiting to shelter. It's easy to look back now and see the Quonset hut as inevitable, but it really wasn't. It was born out of a specific moment of urgency, the marriage of industrial life and practical design. Without Quonset hut, without that Navy order, without the great work of those engineers, the war might have looked very different in the Pacific. The beauty of the Quonset hut was its simplicity, steel arches, and no fence. No matter where you set it out in the desert, they had a Quonset quality, even if it was just for fun. Once the design was finalized in 1941, the United States didn't just build Quonset huts, they churned them out in numbers that defied belief. America's industrial muscle was already gearing up to produce Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, and B-17 bombers. Adding a hut to the list seemed small in comparison, but it became one of the most prolific wartime products of all. By 1945, more than 100,000 Quonset huts had rolled out of factories, enough to house entire armies. How did they do it? The secret was the same formula that drove American wartime industry: mass production. Factories across the country were retooled to stamp corrugated steel sheets, cut plywood panels, and package kits that contained every nut, bolt, and Lego set for grown men, except these pieces built the infrastructure of a global war. Numbers tell the story best. In 1942, the Navy ordered over 25,000 huts almost immediately, and production only accelerated from there. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and later across the Midwest worked around the clock. By 1943, entire ships left American ports carrying nothing but Quonset hut kits, and the men trained to assemble them. The pace was so relentless that huts were often built faster than the military could decide exactly where to go. But the real miracle was how few men it took to raise one. 6 or 8 soldiers with wrenches and hammers could put up a hut in less than a day. No cranes, no skilled carpenters, no engineers on the site, just manpower and a bunch of huts. That speed and ability captured islands and transformed into functioning bases. Almost instantly. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant that wherever the U.S. flag landed, a functioning base followed close behind. By the end of the war, production figures rivaled some of the biggest hardware programs of the conflict. Quonset huts weren't just housing, they were a symbol of America's ability to outproduce, outsupply, and outbuild its enemies. It was one thing to send soldiers overseas, it was another thing entirely to give them a ready-made home, waiting in a crate wherever they landed. Living inside a Quonset hut was unlike anything most American soldiers had ever experienced. For many, it was their first time away from home, and suddenly, their house was a curved shell of corrugated steel planted on foreign soil. These huts were no luxury cabins, but compared to sleeping in a tent with rain and frozen hot, they were a godsend. The interiors were revamped depending on the theme. In the South Pacific, the huts were all lined with insulation, dulled the relentless heat, and screens were added to keep out flies and mosquitoes. Sometimes one at each end, to keep the chill at bay. Wooden floors kept men off the mud, and improvised partitions gave a hint of privacy. Still, most soldiers remembered them as loud, echoing, and often sweltering in the daytime. But here's the thing, Quonset huts weren't just barracks. Their flexibility made them into whatever the military needed at the time. Some became mess halls where hundreds of men lined up for rations. Others were transformed into field hospitals, with rows of cots and the smell of antiseptic in the air. There were huts used as chapels, with crude altars built under the curved roof, where soldiers sang hymns thousands of miles from home. Command posts, storage depots, classrooms, even theaters and makeshift movie nights. If it needed a roof, Quonset hut would do the job. A soldier arriving on an island like Guadalcanal in 1943 could have seen a sprawl of huts, rising almost overnight. In the tropics, the inside could feel like an oven. Ventilation was often poor, and humidity could warp the wooden ends. But soldiers adapted, rigging up makeshift fans, cutting extra windows, and doing whatever it took to make the huts livable. After all, compared to foxholes or open-air tents, this was still a step up. Letters home from GIs often mentioned the huts, sometimes with humor, sometimes with complaint, but almost always with gratitude that there was something between them and the elements. In the words of one Marine stationed in the Pacific, "She ain't pretty, but she keeps the rain out. That's all a man can ask for." And perhaps most importantly, the huts offered a strange sense of cities, you'd find a cluster of huts forming the backbone of a base. In the Pacific, they were indispensable. When U.S. Marines landed on Tarawa in 1943 or on Iwo Jima in early 1945, establishing a foothold wasn't just about capturing ground, it was about building infrastructure. Quonset huts gave them that instantly. Airfields needed control towers, radio rooms, weather stations, and maintenance shops. Instead of waiting weeks for construction, crates were opened, steel arches were bolted, and within days, a bare island bristled with buildings. Some bases in the Pacific ended up with hundreds of huts arranged like a small town, complete with roads and signs. In Europe, they were just as good. After D-Day in June 1944, as Allied troops pushed deeper into France, Quonset huts followed close behind. They surrounded in Normandy and the makeshift hospitals, offices for logistics teams, and barracks for engineers. By the time winter hit the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, Quonset huts were being used as heated shelters, giving troops a break from the freezing Belgian forests. Perhaps the most surprising deployments were in extreme climates. In Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, huts were built to withstand hurricane-force winds and bitter cold. In North Africa, they were planted in dusty camps under a blazing sun, where their curved steel roofs reflected heat away better than canvas tents ever could. In every environment, the same principle applied. A flat-pack building could be shipped and raised faster than any traditional construction. The global footprint was staggering. By 1945, there were Quonset huts on every continent except Antarctica. Soldiers joked that you could tell where the Americans had been by spotting those steel half-circles on the horizon. They became symbols of the U.S. military presence, instantly recognizable even to civilians who had never seen them before. And it wasn't just Americans who used them. Allied nations received Quonset huts through lend-lease programs, setting them up in Britain, Australia, and the Pacific. They were universal because they were, because no other country could solve the problem of rural housing at such scale. The huts became so common that many soldiers assumed their last forever. They turned barren homes into Philippines, carved borders into kingdoms, and gave troops the infrastructure to keep fighting thousands of miles from home. If war is about logistics, then the Quonset hut was one of America's most unsung weapons. By the war's end, it didn't matter if you were on a Pacific atoll, a French farmyard, or an Arctic outpost, you'd see the same curved roofs standing against the sky. They were proof that America hadn't just shipped men overseas, it had shipped an entire civilization with them. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, most people expected the Quonset hut to fade away with the war. After all, these steel arches were meant to be temporary, a quick fix for an urgent crisis. But that's not what happened. Instead, they began a second life, one that would shape post-war America in ways no one could have predicted. First, there was the immediate problem: what to do with all those huts. With more than 100,000 built, the U.S. military suddenly had a surplus on its hands. Many were dismantled and sold as scrap, but thousands more were shipped back home, left standing overseas. The timing was perfect, because America was dealing with its own housing crisis. Millions of GIs were returning to Europe and the Pacific. The GI Bills fueled a surge in college enrollments. Cities and universities needed places for these men and their new families to live, and fast. Quonset huts became an instant solution. Across the United States, colleges set up entire hut villages for veterans. At the University of Michigan, for example, returning GIs and their families lived in Quonset hut communities complete with kitchens, bedrooms, and even little yards. Other schools like the University of Minnesota, Brown, and UCLA did the same. These villages weren't glamorous. Many wives joked about cooking in a half-cylinder kitchen, but they were affordable, fast, and better than nothing. Beyond universities, whole towns sprouted Quonset hut neighborhoods. Some vanish after the war, became landmarks of survival and recovery. Still, they weren't perfect. Families often complained of poor insulation, leaky roofs, and the constant creak of metal. Winters were brutally cold, summers sweltering hot. But for many, these huts represented stability in a chaotic post-war world. They were a stepping stone, a roof overhead while something more permanent was built. The strangest part? Some huts refused to die. By the 1950s and 60s, thousands were still standing, patched with new siding, windows, and insulation. Even today, you can find original WWII Quonset huts dotting American landscapes. Some rusted and abandoned, others still used as storage or workshops. But structures of war time necessity ended up being like the ones in the Quonset hut became just a ingenuity, a reminder of how America's industrial might could solve problems on a global scale. You can still drive across parts of the United States and spot them, half-cylinders of corrugated steel standing stubbornly in fields, on college campuses, or behind workshops. Some are battered and rusted, others lovingly restored, but all of them whisper the same story: built fast, built cheap, built to last. The legacy of the Quonset hut is bigger than just nostalgia. Architects and historians often point to it as a precursor to modern prefab housing. The concept of shipping flat-pack kits and assembling them on site is something we now associate with companies like IKEA. But in 1941, America was already doing it on an industrial scale. The hut proved that modular design was both practical and scalable, and it sparked conversations in the post-war years about solving housing shortages with mass Pacific atolls. They symbolized not just military power, but also the American ability to improvise and adapt. Culturally, the Quonset hut even earned a kind of icon status. Artists painted them, filmmakers used them as backdrops, and writers referenced them as shorthand for the wartime experience. By the 1950s, they had become fixtures in American pop culture, embodying both the grit of war and the hope of rebuilding. In some towns, people still gathered in community centers that were once surplus Quonset huts, their curved roofs arching over dances, meetings, and simple services. The story doesn't end there. In the 21st century, architects and DIY builders have rediscovered the Quonset form of eco-housing in affordable buildings. The same principles of circularity, simplicity, cost-efficiency still make sense today. Some companies still manufacture modernized Quonset-style structures for farms, workshops, and homes, proving that the original design never truly got outstanding. These huts were supposed to be temporary, but like the veterans who once lived in them, they endured. They became markers of a generation's struggle and triumph, still standing as silent witnesses to the war that reshaped the world. So next time you see one of those curved steel shells standing quietly on the side of a road, remember, that humble hut helped win a world war.